If you close your eyes and picture a medieval English peasant sitting down to dinner, I know exactly what you see. A crumbly hunk of rock-hard black bread so tough you could use it as a doorstop. A bowl of thin, gray, flavorless slop they call pottage. Maybe a single shriveled pea for protein. And to wash it all down, a mug of weak ale. Because everyone knows all the water back then was so dirty it would kill you. That image is garbage. Every single part of it is wrong. And today, we're going to tear down every stereotype you've ever heard about what the poorest people in medieval England actually ate. We're talking weird proteins you'd never guess were on the menu, bread that's nothing like what you've been told, survival foods that will make your skin crawl, and the brutal laws that made eating a deer sandwich punishable by death. By the end of this video, you'll never look at medieval history the same way again. And you might just walk away thinking that a peasant's dinner in 1300 was actually better than what a lot of people eat today. No, really. First, let's set the scene. We're talking roughly the 11th through the 15th centuries, from the Norman conquest to the end of the Middle Ages. About 90% of the population was made up of peasants, villains tied to the land as serfs, cottagers with tiny plots of land, and landless laborers who worked for wages. All of them lived at the very bottom of the feudal pyramid, and all of them spent most of their time working to grow food. Now, let's bust the three biggest myths right out the gate, because they're so widespread most people just accept them as fact. Myth number 1: peasants never ate meat. This is the big one. Most people think meat was a luxury only for kings and lords, and the poor might get a bite of bacon once a year at Christmas. That's not just wrong. It's backwards in a lot of ways. Peasants absolutely ate meat. The most common by far was pork. Almost every peasant family kept at least a couple of pigs. Pigs are the perfect peasant animal. They forage for themselves. They eat acorns, roots, garbage, bugs, pretty much anything. You don't have to feed them grain you could eat yourself. Every fall, families would slaughter their pigs, salt the meat, render the lard, and preserve everything to last through the winter. Bacon, sausage, ham, pork rinds, all regular parts of the peasant diet. Mutton and lamb were also common, though less so than pork. Sheep were valuable for their wool, so most families only ate them when the sheep got too old to produce wool or have lambs. Beef was the rarest of the common meats, because cows were essential for milk and for pulling plows. You only ate a cow if it died of disease or injury, or if it was too old to work. So yeah, peasants ate meat. Not every single day, and not huge steaks like nobles ate, but it was a regular part of their diet. The idea that they never touched meat is total nonsense. Myth number 2: all they ate was rock-hard black bread that could break your teeth. We're going to deep dive into bread later, but let's kill this myth fast. The black bread of pop culture isn't real. Peasant bread was dense, dark, and chewy, made from rye, barley, and oats instead of fine wheat flour. But it wasn't made of dirt or wood or rocks, and it wasn't inedible. The rock-hard bread myth comes from trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that people used as plates. The bread would get hard after a week, and you'd put your food on it to soak up juices. Then you'd eat it, or give it to the poor, or feed it to your dogs. It was a zero-waste disposable plate, not a daily meal. People didn't sit around gnawing on rock-hard bread for dinner. That's just not how it worked. Myth number 3: no one drank water because it was all dirty and would make you sick. This is the most persistent myth of all, and it's almost entirely wrong. We're going to cover drinks in depth later, but the short version is medieval people drank water all the time. They weren't idiots. They knew the difference between clean spring water and stagnant pond water. They drank from wells, springs, and fast-moving streams. They avoided dirty, smelly water, just like we do. Ale was still a daily staple, but not because water was deadly. It was a nutritional drink, low in alcohol, packed with calories for people working 12-hour days of manual labor. Think of it like medieval Gatorade, not a way to avoid toxic water. So if all those myths are wrong, what was the real biggest limit on a peasant's diet? It wasn't just poverty. It was the law. After the Norman conquest in 1066, William the Conqueror seized almost all of the forests in England and made them royal property. He created the Forest Law, a brutal set of rules that existed for one reason: to protect game animals, so the king and his nobles could hunt them for sport. Under Forest Law, it was illegal for any peasant to hunt deer, boar, hare, or even small game in a royal forest. It was illegal to fish in the rivers and ponds inside the forest. It was even illegal to cut down trees for firewood or gather wild fruit without paying a fee or getting permission from the king's foresters. The penalties were brutal. Killing a deer could get you blinded, castrated, or hanged, depending on the century. Even killing a squirrel or a hare could get you fined heavily or have your hands cut off. Forests covered as much as a third of England at the height of the Forest Law. That meant thousands and thousands of acres of land full of food were literally off limits to the people who needed it most. And that's the first big twist you never learn in history class. The peasant diet wasn't limited by what was available. It was limited by what wealthy people allowed them to have. There was plenty of food all around them. They just weren't legally allowed to eat it. Now, let's talk about protein: the legal stuff, the illegal stuff, and the weird stuff that nobles would never touch in a million years. First, the number one protein source for most peasants wasn't meat at all. It was dairy: cheese, curds, whey, buttermilk. These were the workhorses of the medieval diet. We're not talking fancy artisanal cheddar here. We're talking hard, salty, crumbly cheese, usually made from sheep's milk or cow's milk, that could last for months without refrigeration. Every peasant family had at least one cow or a handful of sheep. Fresh milk went bad fast, especially in the days before refrigeration. So most milk was turned into cheese or butter. The whey left over from cheese making wasn't thrown away. It was drunk, or used to make pottage, or fed to animals. Nothing went to waste. Dairy was so essential that it was often part of a worker's wages. Landless laborers would get a wheel of cheese as part of their pay for harvesting crops. It was that valuable and that common. For most peasants, cheese was the main source of protein every single day. Next up, eggs. Another protein source so common it barely gets mentioned in history books. Most peasant families kept a small flock of chickens, and some kept geese or ducks. Chickens are perfect for peasants. They forage for bugs and scraps. They don't need much feed, and they lay eggs almost every day in the spring and summer. Eggs were eaten boiled, fried, added to pottage, or mixed into bread dough. They were also preserved in salt or lard to last through the winter, when chickens stopped laying. Even the poorest cottager with almost no land could keep a few chickens. Eggs were a cheap, reliable source of protein for almost everyone. Now let's talk fish. If you know anything about medieval religion, you know the Catholic Church had strict fasting rules. For almost a third of the year, all of Lent, every Friday, and dozens of other holy days, people weren't allowed to eat red meat or dairy. That meant fish was a huge part of the diet, especially for peasants who couldn't afford to break the rules and face the consequences. But what kind of fish for most peasants? It was salted herring. Herring was caught in massive quantities in the North Sea, packed in salt, and traded all over England. It was cheap, it lasted for months, and it was available everywhere. It was also tough, incredibly salty, and you had to soak it in water for hours before you could eat it. But it was protein, and it was cheap. Freshwater fish was a different story. Most rivers, streams, and ponds were owned by the lord of the manor. Peasants weren't allowed to fish in them without permission. And poaching fish was a crime that could get you fined or even put in the stocks. That didn't stop people, of course. Poaching fish was super common, but it was risky. Eels were another staple. especially in the fenlands of eastern England. They were so common and so valuable that they were sometimes used as currency. Peasants would pay their rent in eels. Nobles ate eels too, but they were still seen as a low-class food overall. If you lived near the coast, you could also gather shellfish, mussels, oysters, cockles for free for the most part. They were seen as the absolute lowest of the low when it came to food, but they were free protein. Okay, so we've covered the legal stuff. Now let's talk about the illegal protein, the stuff people poached from the king's forests, even though it could cost them their lives. Most peasant poachers didn't go after deer. That was way too risky, and a whole deer is way too much meat for one family to hide. Foresters patrolled the forests regularly, and a dead deer would be impossible to explain. Instead, poachers went after small game squirrels, hedgehogs, hares, rabbits, foxes, badgers. Small enough to hide, easy to cook quickly, and worth the risk if your family was hungry. And then there were birds. Songbirds, mostly blackbirds, thrushes, larks, sparrows. People would set up fine nets in the woods to catch dozens of small birds at a time. They'd roast them whole, eat them bones and all. They were tiny, but they added up. And since the king didn't care about little songbirds, the penalties were way lighter than poaching deer. Now, a lot of these animals sound weird to eat today. Squirrel, hedgehog, badger. But for medieval peasants, they were just free protein. Nobles would never touch most of them, of course. They ate venison, swans, peafowl, wild boar. Big, fancy game animals that showed off their wealth and status. The idea of eating a squirrel would have been disgusting to a noble. But for a peasant trying to feed their kids, it was a good day. Poaching was so common that it was basically a way of life for peasants living near forests. Everyone did it. Everyone knew everyone else did it. The foresters would look the other way sometimes, for a bribe or a share of the meat. But if you got caught by a forester who was in a bad mood, or if the king was cracking down on poaching, you could lose a hand, or your life. All of these proteins, legal and illegal, added up to a decent amount of nutrition for a medieval peasant in a good year. But let's be clear, protein was never the main event. At most, it was a garnish, a flavoring, a small addition to the real bulk of every meal. The vast majority of calories a peasant ate came from two foods that are synonymous with the Middle Ages: bread and pottage. But if you think you know what these foods tasted like, or what went into them, you're in for a surprise. Because the real story is way more interesting and way more complex than the gray slop you see in movies. Let's start with bread, because bread was life in medieval England. For a peasant, bread made up 60 to 70% of their daily calories. It was so important that the government regulated the price and weight of bread with a national law called the Assize of Bread and Ale. If a baker cheated you on weight or overcharged you, they could get fined or put in the stocks for public humiliation. It was that serious. First, let's talk about the hierarchy of bread, because it's a perfect metaphor for medieval society as a whole. At the very top was manchet, a soft, light, pale white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour, with all the bran and germ removed. It was the good stuff, and it was only for nobles, wealthy merchants, and the upper levels of the church. Peasants almost never ate white bread. It was too expensive, and wheat was the most valuable grain, reserved for the wealthy. For most peasants, the standard daily bread was maslin bread, a mix of rye and wheat flour. Rye grows way better in cold, wet English soil than wheat does, and it's much cheaper. Maslin bread was dense, chewy, dark brown, with a slight sourdough tang. It was hearty, filling, and it lasted for a week or more without going moldy. It was the everyday bread for most people. If the harvest was bad, or if you were really poor, you'd add barley or oats to the mix, making the bread even darker and denser. In really bad years, you'd add legumes, peas or beans, to stretch the grain even further. That's the black bread you've heard about. It wasn't made of dirt or rocks. It was just whole grain bread made from cheaper grains. And yeah, it was tough, but it wasn't inedible. Here's a fun fact for you that poor people's bread from the Middle Ages is basically the exact same thing as the fancy artisanal whole grain rye bread you can buy at Whole Foods today for $8 a loaf. The food that was seen as the lowest of the low 700 years ago is now a luxury for rich people. Wild, right? Now, how did they bake it? Most peasant cottages didn't have their own ovens. Building a brick oven was expensive, and it took a huge amount of wood to heat it up. So almost every village had a communal bakehouse, owned by the lord of the manor. You'd bring your prepared dough to the bakehouse once a week, usually on Saturday, pay a small fee, and the baker would bake all the loaves in the big wood-fired oven. Most families baked enough bread to last the whole week. By the end of the week, the bread was definitely stale and hard. But they didn't throw it away. They used it as trenchers. Trenchers are where the rock-hard bread myth comes from. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread, about 4 inches by 6 inches, that you used as a plate. You'd put your meat, your pottage, your vegetables right on the bread. The bread would soak up all the juices and gravy from the food. Then, after you finished eating, you could either eat the trencher yourself, give it to a beggar, or feed it to your dogs. It was the original disposable plate, but zero waste. Pretty smart, actually. Nobles used trenchers too, but they'd never eat the stale bread themselves. They'd give it to the poor or their servants, because eating stale bread was seen as beneath them. So no, peasants didn't eat rock-hard bread for dinner. They ate fresh, chewy sourdough bread all week, and used the stale ends as plates. The myth comes from people seeing trenchers and assuming that's what daily bread was like. It's not. Now, if bread was the star of every meal, pottage was the sidekick. And it was way more than just bland gray soup. Pottage is basically a thick stew made from grains, legumes, vegetables, and whatever else you have lying around. It's the original clean-out-the-fridge meal. And there were hundreds of different kinds. The most basic, cheapest pottage was just grains, usually oats or barley, boiled in water until they were thick and creamy. That's what you'd eat if you were really broke, or if food was running low at the end of winter. But most of the time, peasants added way more. They'd add peas and beans, which were so important they were called poor man's meat. They're high in protein, cheap, easy to grow, and they make any meal way more filling. They were added to bread, to pottage, even eaten on their own. They'd add vegetables, onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage, kale, turnips, parsnips. All cheap, all easy to grow, all stored well through the winter. They'd add herbs, parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, dill. Herbs weren't a fancy garnish like they are today. They were essential for adding flavor to simple food. If they had a bit of meat or bacon, they'd add that for flavor, or use bone broth instead of water. If it was spring, they'd add wild greens, dandelion leaves, nettles, chickweed, sorrel, whatever they could find. The end result was a thick, hearty, flavorful stew, packed with nutrients and fiber. It wasn't bland gray slop. It was basically the medieval version of a vegetable and bean stew you'd pay $15 for at a farm-to-table bistro today. Yeah, really. There were fancier versions too, of course. White pottage, made with almonds and milk and spices, was for nobles and special occasions. Frumenty, a sweet pottage made with wheat, milk, and honey or sugar, was served at feasts and holidays. But for everyday peasant food, basic vegetable and grain pottage was the standard. Now let's talk about produce: fruits, vegetables, and herbs. First, let's get the obvious out of the way. There were no potatoes, no tomatoes, no corn, no squash, no sweet potatoes. None of the foods we associate with modern European cooking existed in medieval England, because they all came from the Americas after Columbus. That's a really important thing to remember. So what vegetables did they eat? The allium family was king onions, leeks, garlic. These were grown in every cottage garden. They were easy to grow, they stored well, and they added flavor to literally everything. Then there were the brassicas: cabbage, kale, collards, turnips, parsnips. These were cold hardy. They grew well in England's wet climate, and they could be stored in root cellars for months. Cabbage was so common and so cheap that it was seen as the ultimate poor people food. Nobles ate cabbage too, but they'd spice it with expensive imported spices like cinnamon and nutmeg to make it fancy, and separate it from peasant food. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were also staples. They were cheap, they grew well, and they lasted all winter in a root cellar. Carrots existed too, but they weren't orange yet. They were usually purple or white. Orange carrots weren't bred until the 16th century. For fruit, the most common by far was apples. Every village had orchards, and many peasants had apple trees in their garden. Apples were eaten fresh in the fall, dried for winter, or made into cider. Pears were also common, though less so than apples. Berries grew: wild strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, elderberries. Peasants would gather them in the summer and eat them fresh, or dry them for winter. But again, if the berries were growing inside a royal forest, gathering them was technically illegal. That didn't stop people, of course, but it was a risk. Plums, cherries, and grapes were also grown, but they were more expensive, mostly for wealthier people. Grapes were usually made into wine, which was way too expensive for most peasants. Herbs were an essential part of every cottage garden. They were used for cooking, for medicine, for preserving food, even for keeping bugs away. Things like parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, dill, fennel, chamomile, lavender. All common, all easy to grow. Peasants knew how to use herbs to make simple food taste good, and to treat common illnesses. Now, how did they keep all this food from going bad in the winter? Medieval peasants were masters of food preservation. They had to be. If they didn't preserve enough food for the winter, they'd starve. There were no grocery stores, no food delivery, no safety net. The most common preservation method was salting. Meat, fish, even some vegetables were packed in salt to draw out moisture and prevent bacteria from growing. Salt was expensive, but it was non-negotiable. Every household had a stock of salt for preserving food. Drying was another big one. Grains, beans, peas, fruit, herbs, even fish were dried in the sun or over fire. Dried food could last for years if it was kept dry. Dried peas and beans were a staple winter food. Dried apples were a sweet treat. Pickling and fermenting were also common. Vegetables like cabbage, turnips, and cucumbers were pickled in brine or vinegar. Sauerkraut was eaten all across Europe, long before it was associated with Germany. Fermented food lasted longer, and it was also more nutritious, thanks to the probiotics. Peasants didn't know what probiotics were, of course, but they knew fermented food was good for you. And of course, root cellars. Cool, dark, underground rooms where the temperature stayed consistent all year round. Root vegetables, apples, cheese, barrels of ale and cider, all stored in the root cellar to last through the winter. A good root cellar could keep food fresh for 6 months or more. All of this was stuff every peasant household knew how to do. It was basic survival skills. Nobles had all of this too, of course, but they also had access to imported foods that peasants could never afford. Spices from the Middle East and Asia: cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, black pepper, saffron. Sugar, which was super expensive and seen as a spice, not a staple. Wine from France and Italy. Fresh fruit out of season, grown in greenhouses or imported. Nobles loved to show off their wealth by serving food with lots of expensive spices. The more spice you used, the richer you were. It was a status symbol. Peasants used herbs they grew themselves. Nobles used spices imported from halfway across the world. That's the class divide, summed up in a single spice jar. All of this paints a pretty decent picture. Right, hearty whole grain bread, vegetable and bean stew, fresh dairy, eggs, a bit of meat, lots of herbs and fruit. In good years, a peasant's diet was actually hearty, diverse, and surprisingly nutritious. No processed food, no added sugar, no fast food. In a lot of ways, it was healthier than the average modern American diet, especially for low-income people who rely on cheap, ultra-processed food. But here's the catch, and it's a huge one: good years were never guaranteed. Medieval England was plagued by bad harvests, floods, droughts, and famines. The food supply was incredibly fragile. One bad harvest, and things got tight. Two bad harvests in a row, and people started to starve. And when famine hit, the things people ate to survive are almost too horrific to imagine. This isn't movie drama. This is real history. First, let's get some context. Famine wasn't a rare, once-in-a-lifetime event. It was a regular part of life. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, there were at least 20 major famines in England, plus dozens of smaller local crop failures. On average, a peasant would live through a major famine every 20 years or so. The worst of them all was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. It started in the spring of 1315. It rained, and rained, and rained. For almost the entire spring and summer, it poured non-stop. The fields flooded, the soil turned to mud. The seeds that farmers planted rotted in the ground before they could sprout. The hay that fed their livestock rotted in the fields. When harvest time came, there was almost nothing to bring in. The harvest was only about 20% of a normal year. And it got worse the next year. 1316 was just as wet, just as cold. The harvest was bad again. And by the winter of 1316, people were starting to starve. Let's walk through what happens when a famine hits, step by step, so you can understand just how desperate things got. First, prices skyrocket. Grain prices went up 300 to 400% during the Great Famine. A normal worker's wage couldn't buy even a quarter of the food they needed. So first, people cut back. They eat smaller portions. They skip meals. They stop eating meat, then cheese, then eggs. They stretch their food as far as it will possibly go. Next, they eat through their preserved food. All the salted meat, all the dried beans and peas, all the root vegetables stored in the cellar, gone in a few months. Then they slaughter their livestock. First the pigs, then the sheep, then the cows. They eat every single part: the meat, the organs, the bones boiled for broth, the skin rendered into lard. They kill their work oxen, even though that means they can't plow their fields the next year, making the famine even worse. They kill their chickens, so they have no more eggs. They eat everything. Then comes the really desperate part. People start eating things they would never touch in a million years under normal circumstances. First, they go out into the woods and gather every wild food they can find. Wild roots, bark, leaves, grass, moss, ferns. They dig up dandelion roots, cattail roots, any plant that's even slightly edible. They eat pine needles and tree bark. They eat grass, even though it's almost impossible for humans to digest, and it will make you sick. People would wander the fields and forests for hours, looking for anything green to put in their mouths, just to stop the hunger pangs. Then it gets worse. People start eating animals that were considered unclean or inedible. Dogs, cats, rats, mice, horses. People would kill and eat their own horses, even though horses were incredibly valuable for work and transportation. They'd hunt rats in the streets and sell them for money. There are records of people digging up dead animals from garbage heaps and eating them, even animals that had died of disease. There are even reports of people eating leather, shoes, belts, bags, any piece of animal leather they could find. They'd boil it for hours to soften it, then eat it. It's basically pure collagen, almost no nutrition, but it would fill your stomach for a little while. People would do anything to stop the constant, gnawing hunger. And then there's the part that no one likes to talk about: cannibalism. Now, we have to be careful here. Most of the reports of cannibalism during the Great Famine come from chroniclers, monks and nobles writing from a distance. Some of them probably exaggerated to make a moral point about sin and divine punishment. But there are multiple independent accounts from all across Europe describing the same thing. People so desperate for food that they dug up dead bodies from graveyards and ate them. There are reports of people killing and eating their own children. There are reports of travelers being murdered on the road, so people could eat their flesh. Again, this wasn't common. It wasn't like everyone was doing it. It was the absolute last resort for people who had lost everything, who had no other way to survive. But it happened, and that's the level of desperation we're talking about here. This isn't some horror movie plot. This is real life for thousands of people in England less than 700 years ago. And here's the worst, most infuriating part of all. While peasants were starving to death in the streets, eating grass and dead animals, nobles and wealthy merchants were still eating just fine. They had enough money to buy grain at inflated prices. They had their own private stores of food on their estates. They had large tracts of land that produced enough food for them and their households, even in bad years. During the worst of the Great Famine, King Edward II held a huge feast for his court and hundreds of guests. The feast had thousands of pounds of meat, hundreds of dishes, plenty of wine, all the food you could want, while people outside the palace walls were dying of hunger. The class divide wasn't just about having nicer food or fancier spices. It was about living or dying. The wealthy had enough to eat, even in the worst famines. The poor starved, and the laws made it even worse. Even during a famine, you could still be punished for poaching a deer from the king's forest to feed your starving family. The law protected the wealthy's right to hunt for sport, while poor people died of hunger right outside the forest walls. No one knows exactly how many people died in the Great Famine. Estimates range from 10 to 25% of the entire population of England. That's between 300,000 and 750,000 people, dead in just 2 years from starvation and the diseases that come with malnutrition. And it wasn't just England. The famine spread all across Europe. Millions died. The Great Famine was the worst, but it wasn't the only one. Famines happened regularly, for all kinds of reasons. Bad weather, drought, floods, war, pests. Every time, the poor suffered the most. Every time, people had to eat things no human should ever have to eat, just to survive. That's the dark side of medieval food that no one talks about. For all the resourcefulness, for all the hearty stews and fresh bread, it was all one bad harvest away from collapse. After hearing all that, you might be thinking, well, at least they had plenty of ale to drink. Right? Everyone knows medieval people drank ale all day. Every day. Because all the water was dirty and would kill you. It's one of the most famous facts about the Middle Ages. And it's almost entirely wrong. The real story of what peasants drank is way more nuanced, way more interesting, and it will change how you think about medieval life forever. Let's get right to it. Did medieval people drink water? Yes. Absolutely. They drank water all the time. The idea that no one ever drank water because it was all toxic is a total modern myth. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew the difference between clean water and dirty water. They knew that drinking stagnant, smelly water from a pond or a ditch would make you sick. So they didn't do it. Peasants got their drinking water from 3 main sources: wells, springs, and fast-moving rivers and streams. Wells were dug deep into the ground, so the water was filtered through soil and rock, and it was usually clean. Springs were even better, because they were natural groundwater coming to the surface, cold and clean. Fast-moving rivers and streams were also safe to drink from, as long as they weren't downstream from a town or a latrine. People knew not to drink water that was murky or smelled bad, or had trash in it. They had common sense, same as we do. Did people get sick from drinking water? Sometimes, sure. Just like people did 100 years ago in America, and just like people still do in parts of the world today. But it wasn't some constant death sentence, and it definitely wasn't so bad that no one ever drank water. In fact, there are hundreds of medieval records mentioning people drinking water. Monks drank water with their meals. Peasants drank water while working in the fields. Travelers drank water from streams. It was totally normal. So if water was safe, why did everyone drink ale? Great question. First, let's talk about what ale was back then. It wasn't like the beer you drink today. Medieval ale, often called small beer, was very low in alcohol. We're talking 1 to 2% ABV tops. That's less alcohol than most modern non-alcoholic beers. You could drink it all day long, every day, and never get drunk. You wouldn't even feel a buzz. Ale was made from grain, usually barley, that was malted, mashed, boiled, and fermented. The boiling and fermentation process killed off any harmful bacteria that might be in the water used to make it, so it was very safe to drink. But more importantly, ale was packed with calories and nutrients. It had carbohydrates, B vitamins, protein, even some minerals. For a peasant who was working 12 hours a day of backbreaking manual labor, out in the fields from sunup to sundown, ale was a quick, easy way to get extra calories and energy. It was basically a medieval sports drink. Nutritious, safe, and easy to make at home. Almost every peasant household brewed their own ale. It was women's work. Usually the wife of the house would brew a batch of ale every week. It was cheap, it used grain you already had, and it was a staple of the diet. Peasants drank ale with meals. They drank it while working. They drank it when they were thirsty. But they still drank water too. Ale was a supplement, a nutritional drink, not a replacement for water. The idea that people only drank ale because water was deadly is just wrong. Small beer was so common and so mild that even children drank it. Monks drank it. Laborers drank it. Everyone drank it. It wasn't about getting drunk. It was about calories. And that's the key point everyone misses. Ale wasn't a beverage in the modern sense. It was food, liquid bread. Now, ale wasn't the only drink. Cider was huge, especially in the west and south of England where apples grew like weeds. Hard cider was stronger than small beer, usually around 4 to 6% ABV. But there was also weak cider, similar to small beer, for everyday drinking. Cider was often cheaper than ale, and it was a common part of a farm worker's wages. Many laborers would get a gallon of cider a day as part of their pay, to drink while they worked in the fields. Milk was another common drink, but mostly for children and old people. Adults usually didn't drink fresh milk, because it went bad fast and was seen as something for kids. Most adult milk consumption was in the form of cheese, butter, or whey. But if you had a fresh cow, you'd definitely drink milk occasionally, especially in the spring when grass was lush and cows were producing lots of milk. Wine? Almost never for peasants. Wine was imported from France, Spain, and Italy, and it was expensive. It was for nobles, wealthy merchants, and the upper clergy. Peasants might get a sip of wine at a wedding or a church festival, but that was about it. Mead made from honey was even more expensive and even rarer for poor people. And then there's one drink that almost no one talks about, but it was probably the most refreshing thing a peasant could get their hands on: herbal tea. Well, they called it tisanes or infusions. People would boil water and add mint, chamomile, sage, linden flowers, or whatever herbs they had growing in the garden. It was warm, it tasted good, and it was totally free. People drank it for medicinal purposes, sure, but they also drank it just because it tasted nice. And since you boiled the water first, it was always safe. So to recap the drink myth, no, People didn't only drink ale because water was poisonous. They drank water all the time. They drank ale because it was cheap, nutritious, safe, and gave them the calories they needed to work 12-hour days. It was a food first, a drink second. And that's yet another stereotype that's completely backwards from reality. Now, let's step back and put all of this together. What did an average day of eating actually look like for a medieval peasant? How many meals did they eat? When did they eat? What did a typical breakfast, lunch, and dinner look like? First of all, the 3-meal-a-day schedule we're used to today didn't exist for most of the Middle Ages. For most of the medieval period, peasants ate 2 main meals a day. The first meal, called dinner, was eaten around midday, roughly 11 in the morning to 1 in the afternoon. That was the biggest meal of the day. The second meal, called supper, was eaten in the evening, right before sunset, a few hours before bed. That was a lighter, smaller meal. Breakfast, as we know it, didn't really exist for most adults. The Catholic Church frowned on eating before noon, seeing it as gluttonous and a sign of weakness. Most peasants would work for 3 or 4 hours in the fields before they stopped to eat their first meal of the day. They might have a quick sip of ale or a bite of bread on their way out the door. But there was no sit-down breakfast with eggs and bacon and toast. That came later. Children, old people, and sick people were allowed to eat breakfast, of course. And by the late Middle Ages, around the 14th and 15th centuries, breakfast started to become more common for working adults too, especially for laborers doing heavy physical work who needed the calories early in the day. But for most of the period, 2 meals a day was standard. So what did dinner, the big midday meal, look like? You'd have a big hunk of maslin bread, of course. That's the foundation. Then a big bowl of pottage, thick, hearty, made with barley or oats, peas and beans, onions and leeks and cabbage, whatever vegetables were in season, flavored with herbs, and maybe a little bit of bacon or bone broth for richness. If it was a good week, you might have a small piece of cheese on the side, or a boiled egg. If you were lucky, maybe a bit of salted herring or a few strips of bacon. To drink, a tankard of small beer, or cider if you lived in apple country. In the summer, maybe cold water from the well. In the winter, maybe a warm herbal infusion. Supper, the evening meal, was lighter. Usually just bread and cheese, maybe some leftover pottage from dinner, maybe a bit of fruit if it was in season. Nothing heavy, because you were going to sleep soon, and heavy food before bed was seen as unhealthy. They were right about that, by the way. On Sundays and holy days, things were better. There was usually a church feast, or at least a better meal at home. Maybe a chicken or a piece of pork for the family to share. Maybe some eggs, or better bread. Maybe even a bit of white bread for a special treat. On the biggest holidays, Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, there might be a big communal feast with roasted meat, ale, pies, all kinds of good food. Those were the days people looked forward to all year. Now, let's compare that to what a noble ate on a typical day, just to drive home the class difference. A nobleman would eat 3 or even 4 meals a day: breakfast, dinner in the middle of the day, supper in the evening, and sometimes a late-night snack before bed. Their meals had multiple courses, 3, 4, even 5 courses per meal. Each course had dozens of different dishes: roasted venison, swan, peacock, wild boar, all kinds of fancy fish, pies, tarts, custards, fruits and nuts, spiced wines, food flavored with expensive imported spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, saffron, black pepper, lots of sugar, which was super expensive and seen as a luxury. Nobles ate almost no vegetables. Vegetables were seen as poor people food, beneath someone of high status. They ate lots and lots of meat, and lots of white bread, and lots of wine and spiced ale. Their diet was actually way less healthy than a peasant's diet in a lot of ways. High in fat, high in protein, almost no fiber, very few vegetables. A lot of nobles suffered from gout, constipation, tooth decay, and heart problems from their rich, heavy diet. Meanwhile, peasants were eating whole grains, lots of vegetables, legumes, moderate amounts of meat and dairy, lots of fiber and vitamins. In good years, their diet was actually more balanced and healthier than the nobility's diet. And it was way healthier than the diet of a lot of modern low-income Americans who survive on cheap ultra-processed food, sugary drinks, and fast food. Let that sink in. A 13th century English serf, working 6 days a week, tied to the land, living in a one-room cottage with a dirt floor, had a more nutritionally diverse and balanced diet than millions of working poor people in 21st century America. That's not a take you expect to walk away with from a medieval history video, is it? Now, obviously, there are huge caveats here. Peasants had no safety net. One bad harvest, and they starved. They had no medicine, no dental care, no modern health care. Their lives were hard, brutal, and short. Average life expectancy was around 35 years, though a lot of that was high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you could live into your 60s or 70s, if you were lucky. But when it came to food, in good years, it was better than you think. Way better than the pop culture stereotype of rock-hard bread and gray slop. It was fresh, it was whole grain, it was high in fiber and nutrients, it was flavorful from herbs, it was varied with the seasons. And here's the final big twist, the one that reframes everything you just learned. The peasant diet didn't get worse because of poverty alone. It got worse because of progress. Wait, what? After the Middle Ages ended, as we moved into the early modern period, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the diet of poor people actually got worse, not better. Enclosure movements pushed peasants off common land, so they could no longer keep pigs or graze sheep or grow their own vegetables. Commons forests were taken over by wealthy landowners, so people could no longer gather wild food or poach game. Food became more commercialized. Instead of growing your own food and making your own bread and ale, poor people started buying food from shops and markets. And as cities grew, more and more people moved to cities to work in factories during the Industrial Revolution. Factory workers in the 18th and 19th centuries ate way worse than medieval peasants. Their diet was mostly white bread, potatoes, a little bit of cheese, and sugary tea. Almost no vegetables. Almost no protein. Almost no variety. White bread was cheaper than whole grain bread by then, because of industrial milling, and it was seen as better, more respectable, even though it was less nutritious. People worked 14-hour days in factories. They didn't have time to cook hearty stews or bake their own bread. They didn't have gardens to grow vegetables. They didn't have pigs or chickens. They just bought the cheapest, most filling food they could afford. And it was terrible for them. Malnutrition was rampant. Rickets, scurvy, all kinds of deficiency diseases were common among the urban poor. So the stereotype of terrible, boring, unhealthy, poor people food? That's not medieval. That's Industrial Revolution. That's 19th century. And in a lot of ways, it's still with us today. The cheapest, most accessible food for low-income people is still the least nutritious. Ultra-processed, high in sugar, high in fat, high in salt, low in fiber, low in nutrients. 700 years ago, the poorest people in England ate whole grain rye bread, fresh vegetable stew, beans and peas, cheese, eggs, wild greens, and a little bit of meat. Today, the poorest people in America eat white bread, instant noodles, soda, chips, frozen dinners, and fast food. Which one is actually worse? It's a question worth thinking about. Now, none of this is to say that medieval times were better, or that being a peasant was good. It was not. It was brutal. It was unfair. The feudal system was exploitative. The laws were cruel. Famine was a constant threat. Disease was everywhere. Life was short and hard. But when it comes to food, The reality is way more complicated, way more interesting, and way less bleak than the stereotype. Medieval peasants didn't eat rock-hard black bread and gray slop every day. They ate a diverse, hearty, whole food diet that was, in many ways, better than what a lot of people eat today. And that's the real history, not the cartoon version you see in movies and TV shows. The messy, complicated, surprising truth. If you learned something new today, go ahead and hit the like button. It helps the channel out a lot. Drop a comment down below. What surprised you the most? Would you want to try a medieval peasant meal? Or is squirrel stew a hard pass for you? I read every comment. If you want more deep dives into medieval history that debunk the myths and tell you the real, wild stories you didn't learn in school, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got a lot more where this came from. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.